If you're thinking about moving to Australia on a working holiday visa, you probably have a million questions about the visa process and how much to save and where to look for a job and if the spiders really are that bad. So in this video, I'm going to help you out. I'm going to answer all of your questions because I moved myself to Australia in September of last year. And I feel like there's some mistakes I made that I could have avoided and lots of things that I learned. So I'm going to help you guys out and tell you how much to save, how to find a job. All of those questions are going to be answered in this video. So keep watching to find out. Now let's just start with what is a working holiday visa. If you don't know, a working holiday visa to Australia is basically a chance for you to live and work in Australia for a year with the possibility to extend 3 years. Okay, and you can do it if you're from a range of countries, from the US, UK, Canada, Singapore, Japan. There's a whole list of countries. Latin America, really long list of countries that I won't divulge right now, but you can find out easily if you qualify. Generally, you have to be 30 or under, or for some countries 35 or under, okay? So first step is just applying for the visa, which is a really easy process, okay? You just need to apply online, pay the fee, and provide the documents. I didn't have to go in person, I didn't get anything physical, okay? The visa process was super easy. I applied and received it 3 weeks later. You can either apply and receive it like 5 minutes later, or it can take up to like 8 weeks. Okay, so apply a bit in advance, but don't be too worried about the timeline. So without any further ado, let's get into all of your questions about working holiday visas in Australia and everything you should know before moving down under. How much money you need to save. So technically, there is an amount you need to move to Australia. When you're applying for the working holiday visa, you need to have at least 5,000 Australian dollars in a bank account that you can prove. And by prove, I mean provide a screenshot of your bank account with that much money in it. Okay, and while that is the legal required amount, I recommend having a lot more than that because Australia is a very expensive country. You don't know how long it will take you to get a job, and you don't know how long it will take you to find an apartment. And I think that traveling in Australia a bit first is the way to go. So that requires a bit more money at the start. Now, if you want to just get to Australia immediately and you don't want to wait to save up more money, totally fine. You can go with 5,000 Australian dollars and just like immediately look for a job, especially a rural job, because you can make a lot of money doing that. Totally fine. I just wouldn't necessarily recommend it. I think saving up closer to 10,000 Australian dollars is better. And if you want to travel for an extended period of time, I think 15,000 Australian is like ideal for starting there and then finding work eventually after you travel a bit. Also, all of these questions that I'm going to answer are actually in my guide to a working holiday visa in Australia. I have it linked below. It is over 30 pages of just straight information about how to move to Australia, what mistakes to avoid, all of the logistics. It has a CV template, a checklist, everything you could possibly need is in that working holiday visa guide. So get that below, and it's really good to reference as you're going through the process. Okay, so now that you have your money saved up, right, somewhere between 5,000 to 15,000 Australian, or if you're Mr. Moneybags, even more, right? So when you get to Australia, what are we going to do with all this money, right? So upon arrival, you have a few options, right? You fly in. You can decide if you want to start working right away, if you need the money, or you just want to start working right away. Then you just have to pick a city and start looking for jobs, right? That's what you can do upon arrival, start looking for jobs and accommodation. You can stay in one of the 2 major cities you flew into, or you could just go to a random city. Maybe you heard good things about Noosa, so you're like, okay, I'm going to go up to Noosa, I'm going to get a job there. Or maybe you're online and you find a great opportunity in Kangaroo Island and you just go immediately there and you start doing your work there. That's the option, start working. The other option is once you get to Australia, you can actually travel for a bit first, right? You have a whole year to work or to travel. I think traveling when you get there is an amazing option. That's what I did, because you get to see the country a bit, you get to figure out where you like, where you don't like as much, you get to meet other backpackers and other working holiday makers, which is key, okay? And it's just like, who wants to start working when they get to Australia? You know, you want to see the country first. So I think that's a great way to do it. What I did is I booked a tour in Sydney called Welcome to Sydney with a company called Welcome to Travel. And it was a 10-day tour of Sydney and the surrounding areas with like 20 other working holiday people my age from all over the country, or a variety of ages, but close in age to me. And then after the end of that tour, they actually helped me book a whole trip up the east coast of Australia, so from Sydney all the way up to Cairns, which you'll learn when you get to Australia is super common. I would say more than 50% of working holiday people I met did the east coast. Actually, more than 80%. Like, that's just what you do. If you do it at the start or at the end, up to you. I think at the start, it is a great way to do it because you meet so many people when you're traveling up the east coast that when you end up in a city, you might know someone there, you know, and that'd be nice to have a friend there already. So I would also really recommend doing a tour with Welcome to Travel because I met 20 awesome people that I was friends with. And then when I was traveling up the East Coast, I was just bumping into them all the time. So even though I was traveling solo and I moved there solo, I didn't feel alone at all. I felt like I was traveling with all of my new friends. So that's a great option. I also have a discount code for Welcome to Travel up here. I just can't recommend it enough. Like, everyone I know that did it was obsessed with it and recommends it to everyone. So that's a great place to start. If you're a little nervous to move there solo, but you still want to do it, start with a tour with them. And then it kind of breaks the ice. You have friends built in, you know, they give you all the resources for moving there. They help you set up a bank account, a phone number, all of that they deal with. Okay, so let's say you get there and you traveled first or you're looking for work. So let's talk about finding work in Australia and just some of the aspects of working in Australia. So finding work. A big aspect of finding work is obviously location, location, location. You're gonna hear a lot about people saying that they moved to Sydney, couldn't find a job, and so they left and they went to a smaller town and find a job there, or Melbourne, or, you know, any of the major cities. It's gonna be harder generally to find a job in Sydney and Melbourne than in any of the other cities. There's just a really tight job market there. There's a lot of working holiday makers. You know, they are big cities. There are a lot of jobs, but there's more competition versus if you move somewhere like Noosa or Airlie Beach or Adelaide or even Perth, like those cities tend to have a bit less competition in them and you can look for work there. So if you're really set on a big city like Sydney or Melbourne, it's definitely possible. I worked in Sydney and I found a job and met a bunch of other people who found jobs. But it might be easier to go to a different town, and maybe it'd be cool to see like a smaller town life in Australia, something like that. So once you pick a city, how do you even look for work? It really depends on what industry you're going into, but the majority of working holiday makers work in hospitality or tourism or retail, so kind of in-person jobs in stores, cafes, restaurants. And for those types of jobs, the best way to find them is just go in person and hand them your CV. So if you moved to, you know, Double Bay in Sydney, let's say, for example, just walk around the Double Bay area and literally pass out your CV to all of the stores and restaurants and cafes that look nice. Tailor your CV, you know, to the industry and just pass it out in person. Go all over the city, pass out your CV and see if anyone bites. Usually if they are hiring on the spot when you get there, they'll be like, oh, can we set up a trial shift with you? And you'll be like, yes, I can come back in tomorrow. That's typical with kind of in-person job hunting, is it'll just happen like very quickly. They'll be like, oh yes, we are hiring. Can you do a trial shift later today? Great, awesome. Okay, or if you're not interested in working in hospitality or kind of more service-based roles and you want to look for office work, that is mostly found online, okay? Like on Seek is a big site in Australia to find jobs. Seek, there's Indeed, there's LinkedIn. I actually, though, found my job on the third option, which was a Facebook group, okay? This is like not super mentioned, I feel like, but Facebook groups aren't just for finding accommodation. You can find jobs in them. But the key to it is not looking for jobs in the big like backpackers of Australia and East Coast working holiday and Sydney backpacker jobs. Like those groups are full of backpackers looking for jobs, which is great, but it means there's not a ton of people providing the jobs, okay? So I would recommend joining Facebook groups in the local area, posting in there, engaging in there, looking for jobs in your local area. Okay, so those are your options for finding work, right? pick a location, look in person, online, and in Facebook groups. Then once you find a job, or you'll be offered a trial shift. Let's talk about trial shifts. These are very common in hospitality. Actually, they're not just common. Every single hospitality role has a trial shift. And this means you show up, you work for anywhere between 30 minutes and 2 hours. And then based on your experience, the cafe or restaurant and you decide if it's the right fit. I personally think trial shifts kind of suck, but they're just a part of Australian work culture. You have to accept that that's the case. So if you are looking for work as a barista, you'll show up and, they expect you to be experienced, let's say. They know that you're an experienced barista. So they're checking to make sure you're actually experienced. Make sure you have a temperament that's good. So be really positive, put in the work. They don't expect you to know everything, to be clear. Like, you're still a new employee or possible employee. But they want to make sure that like your temperament is right and you have work ethic. That's basically what they want. They're also, if you're looking for like a barista position, you say you have 2 years experience and you actually have 0 experience, trial shifts will weed you out because you're going to have a trial shift and they're going to make sure you can at least do the bare minimum. But yeah, you can find jobs without experience, but there's certain jobs where the trial shifts will weed you out, so don't lie too much. Okay, let's say you did a trial shift and they offered you the job. Okay, what is typical pay in Australia? The minimum wage in Australia is somewhere above $25 an hour, so it's a pretty good wage, even though living in Australia is expensive. And you'll be offered different contracts, and that will affect your pay. So if you're going for a casual role, typically your pay is a bit higher per hour because you don't get any benefits, like you don't get sick leave, you don't get paid leave, anything like that. So your pay will be a bit higher versus if you get a full-time position, you might not make as much, but you have time off, holidays, blah, blah, blah. So typically for hospitality workers, they work casual contracts versus I was an office worker and I worked like a full-time contract. So I got some benefits with that, but your rate is different. You can look up the legal rate online on like the state website. So I looked up the New South Wales Fair Labor website, whatever it is, I'll link it down below. And you can it asks you questions about the type of work you're doing, the contract, and it gives you the legal minimum wage so you know you're not being screwed over. So make sure to look into that. But typically you'll be making somewhere between $25 and $35 an hour, which is great, even though living in Australia is expensive, okay? Another aspect of working in Australia on a working holiday visa is how long you can work. So typically you actually have a limit for how long you can work at one employer of 6 months. But recently the rule did change slightly that if you're working for an employer that is in a certain industry, you can ask to work for longer than 6 months for them. And the industries basically are like hospitality and tourism. There's a whole list. I'll link the resource below. But now it's more flexible with the 6-month work thing, it's a little confusing, but basically if you're working in hospitality or tourism, you can work for one employer for longer than 6 months. And even if you're working outside of those roles, if your employer writes a letter saying that they really need you to the government, sometimes they'll allow it and you can still work there longer than 6 months. So that's another aspect of it. So there's a couple options when it comes to Australian accommodation for working holiday makers. Option number 1, working hostels. Yes, that's a thing. A lot of people will live in hostels long term for like a special price so that they don't have to worry about finding a flat and signing a contract, finding roommates, yada, yada, yada. So a lot of people actually live in hostels. I didn't do that. I just lived in hostels when I was traveling. But when I got to Sydney, I was like, I need to get out of hostels, and I found an apartment. But you can live in a hostel. This is especially common in actually rural areas where you're doing your 88 days and trying to extend your visa. There are working hostels where you can go and stay there for the 88 days, and they even help you find work. But in cities, you can also do it too. Like I had a friend in Melbourne that lived in Melbourne for like 4 months living in hostels. I don't know how he did it, but he did it, and you get a special price. It's typically not like an amazing deal, but gets the job done. Okay, and you can live in hostels. If you're like, ew, Lily, that sounds terrible, Ditto. You can also find a shared apartment, right? Look for a room in an apartment, in an existing apartment contract. I think that is the best option for working holiday makers because you don't have to sign any year-long lease. You don't need to find your own roommates, yada yada. You can just hop into another roommate situation. Typically, you can find these on Facebook groups. You can find it on a place called flatmates.com.au. There's a few different websites. I'll put all of this in the description. And you can look for just a shared apartment, get your own room in it. Even some places you can share a room in an apartment if you're really on a tight budget. And basically, what I recommend is don't start looking for a place until you get to the city, right? If you're looking in Sydney, don't actually start until you get there because any place that you move into, you want to see first, okay? So once you get there, get on Flatmates, get on Facebook groups, look online, go to the viewings. It might take a while. Housing in Australia, there's a crisis, as there is everywhere. But yeah, looking for a room is tough. A lot of people will just take sublets. So like a lot of Australians travel overseas for extended periods of times. You know, they do Euro summer, they go to Asia, whatever, and they'll leave and be gone for like 6 weeks and you can just fill in their room. So sublets are a great option, especially if you're like, oh, I only want to be in Sydney for 3 months. You can just do like 2 to 3 sublets. That is a great option. And I think they're easier to get than like long-term contracts with rooms. But yeah, look on Flatmates and look on Seek. Now, if you want to get your own contract for your own apartment or even like have a group of roommates and find your own apartment, if you're in one of the bigger cities, this might be tough, especially as a foreigner, because you don't have a rental history in Australia. There's certain things that could help you in finding one, as in paying rent up front, being like, oh, we can pay 6 months of rent up front. That can help. But I don't really recommend it unless you're like for sure going to be in Sydney for the full year, because there's so much that can change in your life when you're on a working holiday visa. Maybe you'll lose a job because it's a casual contract. Maybe you decide you don't really like Sydney and you want to leave, blah, blah, blah. I don't really recommend doing like a full year contract right when you get to Australia. I think doing sublets or like short-term rentals, or for me, I just moved in and she was like, it's 4 months minimum. And I was like, great, I can last 4 months. And I ended up living there 5.5 months. But I was like, I don't want anywhere where they're like, you need to be here a full year or we'll charge you, yada, yada. Not ideal. And then how much does housing typically cost? I really can't give you an answer because it varies so drastically all over Australia. What I can tell you is they charge you weekly, okay? It's a weekly basis when it comes to rent. So when it says $400, they mean $400 a week. Okay, in Sydney, I would say a typical price was anywhere between $350 to $500 for a room, maybe $300 to $450 for a room in a shared apartment. It's expensive. Versus if you're out in rural Australia, you could be paying as little as $150 a week. So just look at all the listings and see what seems typical and don't let them rip you off, okay? When it comes to accommodation and signing contracts, Australia has very good tenant rights. I actually didn't sign a contract. I just kind of moved in and trusted her, which maybe wasn't a great call, but honestly, it worked out fine. I think Australians generally are like pretty trustworthy people. Maybe this is a bad call on my part, but I wasn't scammed at all. When I got my first job in Australia and it ended up being like a terrible job and the boss was awful, he still paid me. Like, he didn't rip me off. So I just feel like in Australia, you don't hear as many stories about people getting ripped off as you do in Europe or America. But if you can sign a contract, that's ideal. Read the contract. You know, if you're planning on staying there for 3 months, it's better to sign a contract than not, for sure. Definitely read the contract. But from what I've heard, it's a pretty good place for tenants. And I didn't hear of anyone getting ripped off by their landlord. But be careful, as always. Once you start working or traveling in Australia, and if you arrived solo like I did, you might be scared that you're not going to be able to make any friends or it's going to take a while. Do not worry. There are so many people on working holiday visas in Australia. You're going to be able to find friends. I wouldn't say it was like easy when I got to Sydney to make friends. It took me a few weeks to like make a few different friends, and I wouldn't say I had like a huge friendship group, but I made friends pretty easily. I just posted in Facebook groups, went to events, the usual, you know, just you have to plant roots in that city. When I met someone that seemed interesting, I was like, let's get a coffee. You just have to put yourself out there. That is key. Put yourself out there. Don't expect anyone to contact you. You contact them. You know, same as anywhere. I know in a lot of the major cities, there's a group called Working Holiday Girls, Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, Adelaide. That's a great resource for making friends. There's a lot of different Facebook groups, you know, Brits in Sydney, Americans in Sydney, any sort of local group in your city. Reach out in there, go to an event, go to a book club, make friends that way. You'll find your people over time. Okay, so I've talked about money and work and accommodation and making friends and all this stuff. Let's talk about traveling in Australia, okay? So obviously you move to Australia, you want to travel. Here are some of the spots that most people hit that you probably will want to. Number one, the East Coast, like I mentioned. Pretty much everyone does it at one point or another. Basically, the East Coast means anywhere between Melbourne and Cairns. You can do like the whole thing, or you can just do part of it. Like I personally did from Sydney to Cairns, and then I went to Melbourne another time separately. It's an amazing place to travel solo, let me tell you, because everyone is doing basically the exact same route as you. So you just keep running into the same people that you met along the way, as in you keep running into your new friends. So that is an amazing place to travel solo. Or if you're with a couple or friends, still a great place. Other places to hit in Australia, the Outback. I went to Uluru just for a weekend trip with a company called Mulgus Adventures. It was amazing. It was a 3-night, 4-day trip around to Uluru and Kings Canyon. Amazing. Would recommend. You have to go to the Outback when you're in Australia. It's so unique, so incredible. Another place to travel is to Perth and to Western Australia. I actually didn't make it there, and that is really lame of me. But apparently it's beautiful. It looks beautiful. Doing Margaret River and Rottnest Island. It looks amazing. Another place is to Tasmania. I also didn't make it there, which really sucks because it looks amazing. And then just beyond Australia, when you have, longer breaks between jobs or breaks at your job in Australia, going to Southeast Asia or to New Zealand, it's such an amazing opportunity to have it right next door. And by right next door, I mean it's still like a multiple hour flight, but sort of right next door. Like I did New Zealand for 10 days. It was a 4-hour flight. It was incredible. I would really highly recommend doing the South Island of New Zealand while you're in Australia. It's unlike any place on earth. But yeah, you have so much opportunity to travel while you're in Australia. Do not be afraid to travel solo. There's so many backpackers and working holiday makers. It won't feel like you're traveling solo. It is a little expensive to travel in Australia. I would say typically I was spending anywhere between 100 to 150 Australian dollars a day. So that could be your budget. Honestly, between 100 and 200. Depending on how often you want to get a private room, how many activities you want to do, how often you want to eat out. But that was like budget traveling in Australia is anywhere between 100 to 200 Australian dollars a day. I would say I was probably averaging 140 Australian a day with the hostels and activities and food and all of that. And drinking. That can add up. Okay, and let's say you had an amazing time in Australia and you're like, I want to stay here for another year. You actually can, right? As I mentioned, you can stay between 1 and 3 years on a working holiday visa, but you can only extend it past a year if you do a certain type of work, basically working in a rural area. So there's a whole list of conditions and places you can do it, but essentially you need to work for 88 days in a rural area. The most typical type of job for this is farming or tourism up in northern Queensland, or anything, working at a hotel, working at a restaurant, working at a bar, like out in very remote parts of Australia, and sometimes not even remote. It's also northern Queensland, which means like starting at Airlie Beach, basically working your way up. You can work in any of those cities doing most jobs and it will qualify. I have all of this information in my guide in a much clearer way even, but basically you can do 88 days your first year, which qualifies you for a second year. And if you're crazy enough to extend it to a third year, you have to do a whole 6 months, your second year of rural work, okay? I don't know many people that have done it beyond their second year. I know one person that did it, but that's because he really likes working in rural areas. But most people will just do it for 2 years. Unless you're British, then you're lucky and you can do 3 years pretty easily. But yeah, it's very possible to extend your visa past a year. I didn't end up doing that because I got into grad school, but I would have. If I hadn't gotten the opportunity to go to grad school, I definitely would have stayed in Australia. They make it possible. It's such an amazing place to live in your 20s. I just, there's nothing better. Okay, so I think I covered most questions when it comes to moving to Australia on a working holiday visa, but if you have any other questions, comment below. Make sure to get my guide, because honestly, if you have a question that wasn't answered in this video, it's probably in there because it's over 30 pages of stuff. Yeah, I really hope that you move to Australia and have an amazing time. At times it will be tough, you guys. Don't forget, it's still hard to find a flat, it's still hard to find a job, but right now just be excited, save up some money, and then move to Australia and kiss a hot surfer for me, okay? Enjoy!